Well, welcome. This is week six of the Open Classroom on the 2016 election. I'm Christopher Bosso, your primary host. Michael Dukakis, my friend and colleague, is here tonight. The theme tonight could not be more appropriate, more timely. In his still relevant 1922 book, Public Opinion, the columnist and writer Walter Lippmann wrote, "What each man does is based not on direct and certain knowledge, but on pictures made by himself or given to him." Lippmann, and that phrase, pictures in our heads, which is one of the phrases he comes up with in Public Opinion, sticks with me all these years. Because he was writing at a time when, media were newspapers, and then this new thing called radio. Any other, games of motion pictures, but for the most part, we're talking about newspapers and a little bit of radio. If you think about it, media in those days enabled you, in fact, forced you to imagine in your head what things were like, what things looked like. Yeah, we had pictures of presidents, we sort of knew what they looked like, but we didn't have, we had to imagine a lot of times. And a few decades later, you imagine what Franklin Roosevelt looked like. And indeed, the fact that he was disabled and was in a wheelchair didn't cross people's minds because they didn't see it every day. They weren't reminded every day. Fast forward, and then I also remember images of past campaigns, past elections. As a 13 or 12-year-old, I remember the 1968 Democratic Convention, and the images in our heads was of chaos, of Mayor Daley's police officers chasing the yippies through Grant Park. Or, of course, of the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. So, different election cycles have different imagery. That was a television election, very much so, the new Nixon. Today, if those media in Lippmann's day left us a lot of space to imagine worlds in our heads, today not so much. Media are visual, instantaneous, ubiquitous, and even interactive, as one of our candidates proves to us time and again. And nowhere is this more apparent in the Trump campaign, perhaps, than the current election campaign in general. So our guests tonight are superbly suited to lead us through this landscape. The events of the last week only underscore what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to start with Dan Kennedy. Dan is an associate professor of journalism. He is a nationally known media commentator who writes for WGBH News, the Media Journalism Lab, and other publications. He's a regular panelist on one of my favorite shows, Beat the Press at WGBH every Friday. Professor Kennedy teaches news reporting, media law, and other journalism courses here at Northeastern with an emphasis on blogging, multimedia, and social networks. He is recently a fellow at Harvard Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, where he has written a paper, Bezos Effect, which tracks the reinvention of the Washington Post as a national digital news organization under Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. The paper forms the basis of a new book, The Return to Moguls. Still a title?
So far.
So far, yes. Titles are always between you and your publisher. To be published, we hope, next year. Dan received his bachelor's degree in Northeastern in journalism and master's in American history from Boston University. He'll be followed by Carole Bell. Carole is an assistant professor of communication studies. Her research explores the relationship between non-traditional news media sources, including entertainment media and socio-political attitudes and public opinion. Professor Bell's professional experience spans media and marketing, including work in interactive and direct marketing and interactive media development for various Fortune 500 clients and others. She has worked in public radio, most recently for the nationally syndicated public radio program, The Story with Dick Gordon. Professor Bell earned her PhD in mass communication research from the University of North Carolina, concentrated in political communications and communication effects. She also holds a master's in television and radio management from Brooklyn College and her bachelor's in English and American literature from Harvard. Finally, John Whitby is an assistant professor of journalism and new media here at Northeastern and a faculty member with the Northeastern University Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. His areas of interest and research include social media and social networks, digital storytelling, data journalism, media effects in society, internet and telecommunications policy, and climate change-related communications issues. Previously, he was a lecturer at Boston University and an assistant director at the Harvard Shore Center, where he sort of directed a journalism research center. Professor Whitty writes for the Boston Globe, Pacific Standard, Yale Journalism Lab, and Yale Climate Connections, among other publications. His professional media background includes stints as a reporter for the Star Ledger in New Jersey, where he covered local politics. In New Jersey, it must be really interesting. And environmental issues, and as producer and digital editor for the NPR syndicated show On Point with Tom Ashbrook from WBUR. So all three of our guests have significant radio and written and television work all across the board. He's a graduate of Bowdoin College and holds a master's degree from Columbia University and Middlebury College. So in that order, I'd like you to welcome our guests, Dan Kennedy, Carole Bell, and John Whitty. We'll start with Dan Kennedy. Dan?
Thank you so much for inviting us here. It's wonderful to see Governor and Mrs. Dukakis and to be invited to speak with Chris and John and Carole. This should be fun. It should be a lot more fun than the campaign. I haven't found that to be much fun at all. I do have slides mainly so that I can talk without notes and so that you can look at something other than me. But I'll move through them rather quickly. This is what a normal election looks like, if we can remember. It wasn't really all that long ago. And the media know how to cover these kinds of elections. Because what we do well in the press, I think, is we simply report on candidates' statements, they accuse each other of things, they fight back with countercharges, and I think that the press knows how to do that. We don't always do it perfectly, but I think that more often than not, we can handle that particular task. We produce background stories on candidates' lives and experience. You do see investigative reporting during a political campaign, sometimes exposing some embarrassing details about a candidate's past. And then finally, we cover the horse race. Who's up, who's down, and who's likely to win. And boy, do we cover the horse race. I think that we are rightly accused of doing that to excess. So what do we not do very well? I don't think that the press is very good at reporting on candidates' ideas for dealing with important issues. Now, I would argue that this matters especially during the primaries, because once you get to the general election campaign, usually people make up their minds largely on the basis of party affiliation, which makes sense because, broadly speaking, the Democratic candidate is going to take a more liberal point of view and the Republican a more conservative point of view. But during the primaries, this is when we expect candidates to kind of get into the weeds of issues and give voters a chance to make their decision on that basis. And I don't think we're very good at that. We're also not very good at acting independently rather than running with the pack. I think it's really telling that during this terrible economic crisis that's facing journalism, we still have way too many reporters doing exactly the same thing. Why were all those reporters at the two national conventions? It makes no sense whatsoever, especially when we are struggling to find ways for news organizations to at least break even and continue to be viable. And then finally, I think that we have a very hard time figuring out how to do balance when there is an asymmetry between the candidates. And by asymmetry, I mean when you look at the Obama-Romney race of 4 years ago, you're talking about two candidates who were qualified, intelligent people, each of whom had different ideas for how to run the country. That is a symmetrical race. What's going on right now, I think that by any standards is not symmetrical. And this is what an abnormal election looks like. And we all know what we're talking about here. So the media have a Trump problem. And that is the modern form of political journalism based on notions of fundamental balance cannot work when one candidate is unqualified for reasons of background, temperament, and truthfulness. And, you know, I think that there may be people in this room who disagree, but you can like Hillary Clinton or dislike Hillary Clinton, like her ideas or dislike her ideas. She is a normal candidate with a wide range of experience who's qualified to do the job, and her opponent really is not. As Jay Rosen of New York University has observed, Trump has broken the system. He's broken the media system. The media largely are struggling with what to do. Now we get to one of my favorite questions. What is the media? It's my favorite question because I hate the question. There are so many different forms of media that what we really need to be asking is, what are the media? And I think that different types of media have covered this election in very different ways. The role of television, I think, has been especially problematic in covering the rise of Trump. And I think that's especially true of cable news. Trump was great for ratings. And I think at least until Iowa and New Hampshire, there seemed to be little risk of putting him on all the time, using his presence to drive up ratings, on the certain knowledge that once the voters really got serious about this, he would go away. Nobody's actually going to vote for him. So we have Les Moonves of CBS News saying, it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. CNN, I think, has played a particularly pernicious role in the rise of Donald Trump. Jeff Zucker, who is the head of CNN, also is the person who got The Apprentice off the ground. And he's really fostered Trump throughout Trump's media career. And I certainly don't think that Jeff Zucker is necessarily trying to get Trump elected, but he certainly has had no problem with using Trump to boost CNN. Trump began winning primaries, and by then it was too late. And there's poor Jeb conceding. Now, the role of newspapers has been very different. And in fact, we are where we are at today, and by today I mean literally Wednesday, October 12th, because last Friday, the Washington Post reported the existence of this sex tape. I'm not sure what else to call it. But that has been the latest development that has really rocked this campaign to its core. The New York Times has come under fire to some extent. I think that those of us who have been following this for a long time know that the Times has been kind of chasing the Clintons for 25 years now, and starting with Whitewater and right up to today, it was the New York Times that broke the existence of Hillary Clinton's private email server. But nevertheless, they've also done some great work on Trump. And I think that this week is the Times has broken two of the most important stories, one of the most important stories of this campaign, and that was the existence of Trump's income tax returns a week ago. Seems like 6 months ago, doesn't it? But we learned in the tax returns that Trump had written off more than $900 million in real estate losses and may not have paid federal income taxes for 18 years. The Washington Post, I think, has stood particularly strong. One reporter, David Farenhold, has done a ton of reporting on problems with the Trump Foundation And he also is the person who, as I said, revealed the existence of this sex tape. The Washington Post these days is owned by Jeff Bezos, the founder and chief executive of Amazon. I think one of the things we wondered about with Jeff Bezos was, okay, this is great. A millionaire comes in to try to reinvent one of our great newspapers. Will he have a backbone when he's pushed up against the wall? And as it turned out, he would do Katharine Graham proud, because he has really stood up when Trump has threatened to go after Amazon if he's elected president on the basis of tax returns and other things, tax benefits. But even the biggest stories fizzle without the media echo chamber. So there's kind of a synergy between our great newspapers and television, where if television doesn't really pick up these stories, it almost doesn't matter what even the New York Times and the Washington Post are reporting on their front pages. Now, some of these stories I've talked about recently have indeed made it into that media echo chamber, and that's why we see Republicans abandoning Trump left and right, well, mostly right, and Trump's numbers falling quite precipitously. There's a debate about false equivalence, and that's the idea that it's like if you report that the sun sets in the west, you better find somebody to say that the sun sets in the east, or you'll be accused of bias. I think there's an institutional bias toward balance, and I mentioned that earlier in the media system being broken. I think that when we got into, after the media was kind of done with Trump's attacks on the Khan family, I think that some Trump fatigue set in. I believe that there were a lot of people in the media who thought that the election was over, and it was time to sort of apply the normal vetting to Hillary Clinton that you normally would apply, and not particularly worry about Trump anymore, because after all, he's lost the election. And of course, what we saw for a few weeks was that Trump came roaring back in the absence of that kind of scrutiny. And as I said, there was a sense that the race was over. There's two other factors that I actually don't think apply, but I'll put them out there anyway. One of them is that the media want a horse race. People who say this tend to think that the media are driven more by immediate financial and circulation and ratings imperatives than I think is actually true. And then finally, the press despises the Clintons. Again, I think that's actually true in many respects, and it has been for a long time. But I don't really think that's fundamentally the driving dynamic in this particular contest. The debate, this was the first debate, that debate really changed the dynamic. So where do we go from here? I'm actually going to wrap up a little bit early, which is great because I see all these people here and I know that we want to get to a conversation. So anyway, one of the big debates that's going on within the media right now is, do we call out lies? And do we call them lies? Calling statements by politicians a lie is problematic because you can't really know what's going on in their heart and their mind. But I think that we've seen some use of the L word in this campaign, because when it's pointed out over and over again that a candidate is saying something that's completely false, and this candidate is generally Donald Trump, you just look at the ratings at a fact-checking website like PolitiFact, then it must be deliberate at a certain point. But fact-checking has a limited effect. Trump supporters will tell you that the fact-checkers themselves have a anti-Trump bias. Should we move toward a more partisan press, a more explicitly partisan press, such as the press that we had through much of our history? That may be a way of being a little bit more honest and direct with the public, but the public already believes that we're biased. So that is also problematic. And then finally, maybe what we ought to do is accept that many of the voters are better informed than we give them credit for. I think there's a certain tendency on the part of the media to believe that, well, these voters are saying that they're backing Trump. We must not have informed them enough. And I think in many respects we have. And Trump supporters are so angry and so disaffected that they don't care. They've made their decision that they're going to vote for radical change, and that's that. So that may point to a real limitation on what we really can expect from the press. It could be that if we think that the press is going to destroy Trump, if that's what we want them to do, I think that maybe we're expecting too much. And that's all I've got. So with that, I believe that Carole...
The three phases of popular culture and Trumpism. So first, I'm going to start with the before Trump period, because it's really important. I gave a talk about gender and racial discourse in this election last week, and I sometimes feel as though people talk as though Donald Trump invented racial appeals or invented Islamophobia, which he did not do. He may have elevated these things to a central role in this election, but he didn't invent them. And he even did not really invent at all popular culture politics and the culture of celebrity and its involvement in our presidential election. He really didn't. So I want to talk about that first. And then I'll talk about the making of Trump the candidate and the role of the media in that. And then I want to talk about phase 3, which we're currently in, which is sort of the rise and potential fall of Trump the statesman, Trump the GOP presidential nominee. So, looking at the period before Trump, I would like to talk a little bit about the rise of pop culture politics. So, the rise of pop culture politics is in many ways enabled by certain structural transformations within the media industry. And these transformations have really redrawn the boundaries of political communication and in some ways very much facilitated the Trump candidacy. And the two major trends that I would identify here, first and foremost, are the proliferation and multiplicity of platforms and channels. So we're now in this multi-platform environment that includes cable television, of course, and it's hundreds of channels. It also now includes social media, but we have this diversity of platforms and channels that has really, in a way, helped to shrink the audience for traditional media. But at the same time, we also have this consolidation of media ownership, and that's also just as important. So we have kind of a splintering of the mainstream media audience. And then we have media ownership consolidation, which is focused, of course, people were always expected to make a profit, but news media divisions within national networks were not expected to make a profit, right? So in the old days, in the broadcast era, there was this thing that we used to call, broadcasting in the public interest. So they were expected to perform a public interest role, and not necessarily responsible in the news division for the making of profit. That is no longer the case. Now we have the melding of these roles and barriers, and everyone is expected to make a profit, and especially media conglomerates owning media companies has really helped to accelerate that process. So the effect of all of that is that traditional media, the newspapers that are playing such an important role, and even the traditional CBS, NBC, ABC broadcast evening news don't have quite the same gatekeeping power that they used to have. So Dan ended up saying, we can't really expect the media to perform this role of stopping Trump. They really couldn't, even if they wanted to at this stage, right? So the power of gatekeeping it has really been diffused. It's not to say it doesn't exist anymore, it certainly does, and television definitely retains a certain amount of power, but that's divided up quite a bit. and the more partisan, ideologically bent networks on cable, like Fox and MSNBC, are playing much more central roles in our day-to-day experience of this 2016 campaign than maybe some of the traditional networks. So we have those two things happening. And of course, we also have increasingly the campaigns using all types of media, film, TV, social media, to reach an audience, to reach citizens, especially young voters. But here's the thing. A few years ago, Al Franken said that we were living in an era in which the wall between news and entertainment has been eaten away like the cartilage of David Crosby's septum. So Crosby at the time, was a self-confessed cocaine addict, and had been suffering from that problem. And it's a really interesting metaphor because it talks about that division being eaten away, and he's right. So the division between entertainment and news has been eaten away. But here's what he was missing. The barrier between news and entertainment and public affairs has always been somewhat artificial. Okay, so entertainment has always played an important role. So our traditional view was that you had the news as being the primary source of information for public affairs, and that there was a separation between politics as part of public life and the public sphere and entertainment. But really, increasingly, communication scholars have recognized that the political information environment, which is a term that Michael Dukakis and Bruce Williams, I think, were maybe the first to use in their book about this. The political information environment is much more broad-based, and we really need to think of that in a much more holistic way. And Michael Dukakis is the dean of the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's done quite a bit of research on this. And what we have to face is the fact that the lenses through which we interpret politics are really shaped by a variety of media. We don't simply get our news and information about the need for healthcare reform from the evening news. We get it because we are also watching ER, or because, what are some of the other ones, like whatever, the current medical drama. There's an entire book about the effect of medical dramas on people's knowledge, of medicine and public health and so on. Right, so we're in this environment in which people interpret politics from a range of cultural sources they get their information. And this is something, entertainment being a venue, even for campaigning, is also something that's not new. So 1960, before he was the nominee for the Democratic Party, JFK went on the Jack Paar Show, which is the predecessor to the Tonight Show. So entertainment media has long played a role in political image making. So that's 1960. 1992, we have candidate Bill Clinton in his first run going on the Arsenio Hall show and playing the saxophone. And these types of appearances really help to play into that personal side, right? So a really important part of who we choose to, and who we prefer, is this sort of personal, do we like them? Do we want to use the cliche, have a beer with them, right? That became the metaphor that we used. And so in 2009, that's not Barack Obama, that's the next one. So supporting his economic recovery plan, President Obama goes on Jay Leno. And that is a milestone because prior to that, we had candidates going on entertainment, but not a president. He was the first sitting president to actually do entertainment. And, he's very much, contributing to this politics of popular culture as well. He goes on Kimmel to read his mean tweets. He goes between the ferns with comedian and comic actor Zach Galifianakis to raise support and awareness for his agenda. I think he was specifically promoting the Affordable Care Act and enrollment in that. And young people have also increasingly turned to late night talk and comedy, right? And, one survey even claims that Jon Stewart is the most trusted figure in the news. So we really have to, if we're going to understand how Trump comes about being, we have to accept the fact that this division that we have in our heads between information and entertainment is really one that that we can no longer sort of click claim to. So that's a picture of, I don't remember the name of the admiral, but being interviewed by Jon Stewart, and it's one of just Jon Stewart's many sort of like more serious long-form interviews that really show that it's not just that entertainment is a venue to promote things, but rather there's this thing going on that Nat Bain calls discursive integration. And that basically means that the different formats, the news format and the entertainment format, are coming together and influencing each other. So Jon Stewart not only does the fake news, but he really incorporates many of the characteristics of the genre of news and the genre of talk, right, of political talk shows into his show. So we have this discursive integration in which late night entertainment is taking on some of the characteristics of the news, but it goes two ways. And if you can read this, it's one of my favorite cartoons. You have these two newscasters sitting there and at the news desk, and one of them says, and a text here from Stuart in Gloucester, ha ha ha, that cracks me up, LOL, you're the greatest. And I think that to me this cartoon really is sort of emblematic of what's going on, because it's not just that entertainment is encroaching on news. It's that news has taken on the characteristics of entertainment to an even greater degree, right? They always had to have an appeal to the audience. They always had to be entertaining to some extent. But now they are expected to be entertaining on a really sort of like a really different level. So within this particular environment, you have Donald Trump. And he has been angling to potentially run for president for quite some time. But the moment that he picks in 2015, when he starts and he declares its run, is kind of the perfect time for him to enter. The other thing that's happening in the industry that enables him is the rise of unscripted television. So whereas in the past, entertainment television, primetime television was dominated by scripted shows, sitcoms, and dramas, reality television, or really unscripted, supposedly unscripted television shows, both the ones that follow people in the competitions, these become, really start to dominate the television landscape. And The Apprentice, as I said, debuted in 2004. In that year, its season finale drew more than 40 million viewers. And that is a viewership that is, in this age of fragmentation, audience fragmentation, really quite a remarkable size audience. And it is, in its debut, the highest rated show among 18 to 49-year-olds, which is the most coveted demographic for advertising. So the making of Trump, has a lot to do with that rise, obviously, of reality television. But it's also because our politics are skeptical. Our politics are largely, symbolic. And he is a master at that sort of image making, right? So even his announcement of his candidacy in June 2015 is a spectacle. He comes down the escalator, right? So he knows how to make an entrance. And in our current environment, image and reality are one, or really image in a way is more important than reality. So his image is that of a truth teller. And that remains, right? This idea that he tells it like it is. He doesn't sound like your regular politician. That's a really important part of the Trump image. And yet, PolitiFact, which Dan also mentioned, estimates that at least 70% of Trump's claims were untrue during the primaries. But that is not his image. Instead, he has this image of being, the populist, the person who isn't like other politicians, and he is really working hard through the use of repetition and other rhetorical strategies to make sure that the public sees Hillary Clinton as being the one that is dishonest. So we have Trump the candidate, and he is very good at spectacle making. He's also really good at cultivating a cult following, right? So he's really good at these. He doesn't do your regular retail politics very much. He doesn't have small events where he shakes hands a lot. He does these major rallies because his strength is, the celebrity appearance. So he has a huge and loyal following on social media as well. and this enables the direct transmission and greater control of messaging. And that's important because, again, we're seeing, especially now, but really starting in the fall and accelerating in the spring as people start to take him more and more seriously, you do see newspaper endorsements especially starting to go against him. But as I said, there's a waning gatekeeping power and influence of traditional media, and there's the rise of social media. And in that environment, when he boasts of 25 million followers in Facebook, and followers on Twitter and Facebook, and in that environment, he can directly communicate with his following, and they become incredibly loyal. So the news media, he has a perfect record of getting 0 endorsements from major media outlets. 0. All of the major media outlets have either endorsed Hillary Clinton or another candidate. Some of them have endorsed Gary Johnson. But nonetheless, you have this loyal following. You have people who love to tweet the hashtag MAGA. How many people have ever seen that before? Okay. So it's a short for Make America Great Again. Exactly. And so he's really good at these, these phrases and these memes. So his celebrity status means that he's not only invited to Saturday Night Live, but he really attracts a great audience on Saturday Night Live. 8 other presidential candidates have hosted Saturday Night Live, not just appeared on Saturday Night Live. But Trump's appearance makes more headlines than everyone else's. In addition, Trump, he becomes such a figure of celebrity that regardless of whether the news is positive or the news is negative, he's benefiting from an incredible amount of what's called earned media, free media, basically media coverage. So during the primaries, a research report came out about this, that he earned a record-setting $2 billion worth of media coverage during the primaries. In the month of February 2016, during the primaries alone, the estimate is $400 million. That $400 million is equivalent to what John McCain spent on his entire 2008 presidential campaign. You look at it on this chart, on the left, we see bought media, so your ad spending. And on the right, we see the earned media coverage. Do you see the length of the line of the amount of exposure, media coverage that Donald Trump got? I mean, it just simply dwarfs that of every other candidate. And really, the ad spending couldn't compete with that. It's, what, 3 times what Clinton got? So it is a crowded field of originally 17 contenders, but his celebrity status and the fact that his tweets are considered newsworthy, and the fact that he has virtually unfettered access to venues like Morning Joe on MSNBC and to Fox, he's citing Sean Hannity as his right-hand man, pretty much, as his evidence that he was against the Iraq War. The media really become an arm, a potential arm of his campaign. But I'm going to wrap up on the third phase, and that's, as I said, the phase that we're in now, and this is the phase in which he is a celebrity in the public sphere. And he's obviously not the only one. We've had many celebrities in the public sphere, and in fact, we've even had a president who originated in the public sphere, who became one of our most popular, probably the most popular president in the modern era, Ronald Reagan. All right, so we're used to having celebrities in the public sphere, but in the past, celebrities in the public sphere have tended to adopt the norms of the public sphere. So when they come on the public scene, they may be coming from, this is Emma Watson, she may be coming from Harry Potter, but when she shows up to speak about women and feminism, she dresses and she speaks and she has her homework done and she's knowledgeable about policy and she gives a serious talk about the status of women, right? That is how celebrities usually conform to the differing norms of the public sphere. Trump in his public sphere does something entirely different. He says that, and I think to a certain extent he's right in this, that he's not the typical candidate, and that is part of his charm, right? And he has considerable charm to a significant portion of Americans. So he's less steeped in policy specifics, and newspapers are writing about this. He's less steeped, I would argue, than the typical celebrity who becomes a UN goodwill ambassador. He's also plagued by scandals. Until now, he's been somewhat immune to them. Until now. So I think it's kind of symmetrical and interesting and potentially fitting that the celebrity and popular culture that made him may also be his undoing, because it is his fame from The Apprentice and his exposure on Access Hollywood and his ownership of Miss Universe that has made him such a celebrity figure, but it's also now threatening to undermine his role as a serious statesman in the public sphere. So I will end there.
Basically, I have three broad trends tonight that I want to think a little bit about, and then drill down on some, as I said, some data and some context, both in terms of social media and in terms of kind of the broad societal changes that we're seeing. So, three broad trends. One that's just continuing to accelerate, in which the other two panelists touched on, is this concept of disintermediation, which is the idea basically of going directly to audiences, going directly to citizens and directly to voters. And social media allow that. We know that YouTube and Facebook and Twitter were around in 2008 and 2012, but I think what we've really seen is those channels becoming really mature in terms of the scope and reach. So I think we have ABC and CBS and NBC and Fox and CNN, but I also think we have Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to some extent as actually legitimate channels for communication that have that kind of mass broadcast power, and I think that's just important to keep in mind. The second point I want to make tonight is something about intention. I think as things get busier online, as more voices join, which is a terrific thing in terms of the democratization of communication, I think that also makes attention harder to get. It's harder to keep. It's harder to earn. It's extremely difficult to break through, even for people who have large megaphones like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And then some of the theorists of media have started to talk about how there's this idea of present shock. And so the media theorist Douglas Rushkoff has talked a little bit about how the real-time environment of social media puts a real emphasis on the novel and the new, and sort of creates a kind of cycle of constant churn. And I think one of the things that the candidates have really realized, and particularly Trump, is that novelty and conflict are able to cut through a little bit in those sort of real-time mini news cycles that we see that seem to be going sort of minute by minute. So those are my three broad themes, and then let's look at some data. Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
A little bit hard to see here, but I just want to give you a very precise sense of who's been doing what in terms of the candidates. So this is Donald J. Trump. His total messages on social media during the entire campaign cycle are 10,850. This is according to the Illuminating Project, which is out of Syracuse University's information school. And it's probably hard for you to see, but in terms of the distribution of kinds of messages, the most frequent kind of message is an informative message, which is something about the campaign. Join me for a rally in Ohio. Come join us as we do X, Y, and Z. But it's something about the nature of the campaign. That's the yellow line that you can see in the bar chart. Second would be advocacy. So, my campaign is great. I'm great. My issues and positions I'm taking are great. So that would be second. And then third is attack mode. And so actually it's only about a fifth of his overall messaging, which I think is kind of interesting. And this one I think is going to surprise you. Oops. Actually, let me just say a bit about what are the messages that went viral, like that truly reached mass amounts of people. His most the tweet that received the most likes, and by the way, I think everyone knows what Twitter is, but it's a microblogging platform in which you have 140 characters, and you send out a message, and people can kind of give a thumbs up, or they can rebroadcast it or retweet it to their followers. So his most liked tweet was, "Happy Cinco de Mayo. The best taco bowls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics." Right. So deeply problematic for many Americans, maybe not so much for many of his followers. We'll compare that to Hillary Clinton's most prominent tweet. So remember his numbers as we go to Hillary Clinton. She has broadcast 12,524 messages, so actually a little more than Trump. Actually, by a significant margin more. You'll see that also her informative messages, the yellow line, sort of lead. Second is advocacy, and third is attack. And we'll see in a moment, she's actually been in sort of social media attack mode as much, if not more so, than Donald Trump. We don't quite notice it, and I'll explain why, but she's certainly been very tough in social media. And so her top tweet of all time was, "Tonight, Hillary goes head-to-head with Donald Trump in the first presidential debate. Share this if you're standing with her." Right. So more conventional message. By the way, her number 2 is delete your account, which was to Donald Trump. After he was, I think it was when he received the endorsement of Barack Obama. She received the endorsement of Barack Obama. I forget the sequence there. Here's another. I was talking about Hillary Clinton being very tough on social media. The purple and the sort of dark purple and the lighter kind of purple blue are Hillary Clinton, and the 2 reds are Donald Trump. And the darker purple is actually Hillary Clinton attack. So what the Syracuse folks did is they coded each message either on Facebook or Twitter or another platform. And you can see that actually Hillary Clinton has sent more attack messages than Donald Trump. Really interesting, right? You wouldn't necessarily think that that's true, but if you actually look at the data, that's actually true. And she has significantly, and these are the months of June, July, August, September, October, she's actually significantly outpaced him in terms of numbers of messages. She has a very sophisticated team. I think having seen what happened to John Kerry in 2004, knows that not to respond to attacks and not to attack back is a real liability, and I think that team has definitely taken a lesson from that election. So how are the candidates driving conversation, and how are their statements and their actions driving social media discussion? Well, here's just one snapshot. By the way, this comes from a project at MIT called Electome, and they discussed some of their data in the Washington Post. On August 23rd or thereabouts, Trump signals he may change his mind on mass deportations of unlawful immigrants in the country, and the number of tweets about immigration policy goes up. Same thing happens about a week later when he goes to Mexico and then makes his incendiary speech on immigration. So he's really able to drive through actions, some degree actually policy discussion. So what they're measuring here are core electoral issues. Our own David Laser is a political scientist and network scientist here at Northeastern. Did some really great work studying kind of semantic patterns of Trump and how he operates on Twitter. And so the most frequent words, the top 10 most frequent words are I, you, great Trump, he, real Donald Trump, we, thank, my, and Trump 2016. So these are the Trumpian terms. And other Trumpian terms include winner, failed, worst, nasty, loser, bad, stupid. I thought there's some interesting and revealing things about that. I just put in the words Trump tweeted as within quotation marks, so that means the journalist in the article use those terms in that way. And I got 35,800 results in Google News, right? So that means, and Carole touched on this, that tweets are news. I mean, they really are, right? I mean, he's using this broadcast channel called Twitter to generate news articles. And we see that over and over again. It's a very smart strategy in a lot of ways. Trump tweeted 35,800 news articles based on his tweets. And I'm sure if we coded it kind of differently, we would get even more results. Okay, so Hillary Clinton is also able to drive conversation on social media when she does it right, and she often does. And this was a case where maybe she didn't do it right. She actually had to apologize, but she spoke rather forcefully about some of Donald Trump's supporters, calling them deplorables. She spoke about the alt-right, which is a kind of white nationalist movement that has kind of come to the fore in the election and has a fair amount of representation on social media. I'll touch on that when I get to the end. But so, what's the difference here? Like, why is it that we're saying Donald Trump is, just a social media animal and sort of owns that space, and Hillary Clinton, is nowhere to be found? Why is that this public impression? Well, part of it is, as the Pew Research Center put it, in every measurable category of user attention, Facebook shares, comments, and reactions, as well as Twitter retweets, the public responded to Donald Trump's social media updates more frequently on average than to either of the candidates' posts. This is at a time when Sanders was still around. But it's just I think it's a combination of personality and message resonating. Here's just one day in August where the share of the conversation overall on Twitter, you can see that Trump sort of owns a much bigger share than Clinton does. But nevertheless, I guarantee you, if we look at that day, Hillary Clinton has a lot of messages going out and is very engaged there too. So what does this all mean? And how does it fit into the wider patterns? I don't quite know how I'm doing on time, but yes, okay, you yanked me off stage with a hook when it's time. Social media, I think, is puzzling to various people in terms of how much impact it has. Is it really driving conversation? Is it really taking over our communications ecosystem, or is it not? So let's look at some hard data on this, and this is again from the Pew Research Center. Beyond Facebook, small portions of the public learn about the elections on social media. So the percentage of adults as a whole from the beginning of the year who learned about the 2016 presidential election in the past week. 37% said Facebook, 11% YouTube, 9% Twitter. Really important to remember that, like, overall, not that many people are on Twitter. I forget what it is of the US adult population, it's actually small. But what's important is that it generates a lot of the free media that Carole referenced. And let's look at some other data. So if you ask people which medium is the most helpful in terms of learning about the 2016 presidential election, among the millennials, so technically 18 to 34, but they defined it as 18 to 29 right here, 35% said social media, so that's a third. But still, that's only a third of millennials, right? So social media sometimes can seem like an unstoppable and ubiquitous force. Not really always the case if you actually look at the hard data. And if you go up the age demographics, 30 to 49, 21% say cable news, 50 to 64 cable news, 65 plus cable news, right? Television still plays a huge role in the democracy and in terms of communications. And I'll skip this. The other thing about social media that I think we need to understand is that not everyone uses it actively. In fact, the number of people, the percentage of people who actually do things like post links to news stories, comment on news stories, discuss issues in the news on the platform, it's actually a very, very small percentage, in the single digits often. Most people are pretty passive on social media. So some context there. And then just wider societal context. Because of this thing, the smartphone, this is an incredible graphic, I think. This is from Mary Meeker, who's a tech guru and gives a presentation every year about the state of the internet. In 2008, Americans were consuming about 2.7 hours per day of digital media. And then you can see, because of the green piece, the light green piece on the bar chart, by 2015, they're consuming more than twice what they were in 2008. 5.6 hours a day consumed in digital media, and almost 3 hours of that is consumed through mobile phones. So that at a societal level, we're going through an incredible change in the use of our time and the use of our attention. Couple more points and then I'll wrap up. I mentioned attention and the competition for attention. This is a paper by Sharad Goel at Stanford and some others. They looked at 1 billion tweets. I think it was in 2013, and they tried to study how many actually reach large numbers of people. And it turns out that to go truly viral, which would be the pattern at the bottom, right? Many generations of sharing, people passing the message along, word of mouth, but only digitally. That happens about 1 in a million pieces of content shared on the Twitter platform. The majority of things that are shared online go nowhere. They're very short and shallow patterns of sharing. So as more people join these platforms, it becomes only harder in some ways to really cut through and break through. And I talked about the platforms maturing before, and I think that's part of this. I'm running out of time. 2 more things. When we look back at 2016, will people say, this was the X, the YouTube, the email, the Facebook, the Twitter election, right? So we've been able, since about 2000 to brand each successive presidential election as characterized by one new technology that people adopted. Email and websites in the case of 2000, 2004, and then Facebook, and then Twitter, and YouTube. So a lot of journalists have speculated it's going to be Snapchat. So it turns out that Snapchat, which is basically a person-to-person messaging application, has not been as successful as people, and as influential as people thought it was going to be. So the technology story, and I could be wrong about this, one of my good old buddies actually runs news for Snapchat, so I apologize to Peter, but I think that the long and the short of it is that it's unclear that any breakthrough technology is going to define this particular election in the way that maybe the past few cycles have been defined by one. And then finally, I think one of the long-term implications of this particular cycle and social media is that it has, inarguably, I think, put a new set of people and groups onto these platforms. Many people have been worried about the degree of harassment, the degree of hate speech, the degree of really sort of vile ideas proliferating on these platforms. And there is no doubt, I think, that more of it's happening. The social media companies themselves are struggling to figure out what to do about it. And I think that's going to have a very, very long-term effect. Because I think as a society we need to figure it out, and I think that sort of the genie's out of the bottle now. So with that, I'll wrap up.
The difference between the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign and use of Twitter is the fact that we know that some of those tweets coming directly from Donald Trump himself. We don't know this thing Hillary Clinton doing herself. It's like
I thought we did. Aren't hers signed with? I think if it's directly from her, there's an H at the end.
Did you really think her fingers are on the?
That's the. Okay.
Yeah,
Where's the?
Flip up.
That's the convention, and it's certainly Barack Obama when he tweets does that, and Michelle Obama does uses the initials. But honestly, I've never seen a tweet that had that. Have you seen one that had? Okay,
Rarely.
So it's rarely, right? So she has, I think, a very skilled social media team, but we know we don't expect it to really be in her voice. So her most popular tweet, or second most popular tweet, was delete your account. And that is completely, that's like a typical Twitter insult to really say, you are so terrible at this, delete your account. And that is not something, I don't really envision Hillary Clinton being so savvy and being such a Twitter hat that she's like, sitting there going, getting that singer out there. So I think it's used in a different way. And then the information that you presented, John, about attacks and what percentage of the time the Trump account versus the Hillary Clinton account treated attacks, I'm not really that surprised that it's a higher percentage for the Clinton account, but the difference is when Trump tweets an attack, it's, you're a loser, right? So again, I mean, I've talked a lot about social norms, and I think one of the things that's really outstanding about him is that he violates social norms, so he doesn't say, you know, her thing would be, you know, I mean, sometimes he might, but, you know, the Clinton account will say Trump's tax plan is a giveaway to billionaires like himself. That is one line of attack she's used, so that counts as an attack. But she's weak, she doesn't have the look, she doesn't have the stamina, so-and-so is a loser, or a bad actor. That, you know, is a different quality. So I think those are more memorable in some ways, and they're less political, and they violate social norms, so I think that they're, you know, it feels different.
I've found my name's Margaret Wheeler. And I found one of the troubling things about this campaign is the number of people you see being interviewed who say, Trump has the nerve to say things that I've thought but have been afraid to say, which sounds as if there's a whole undercurrent of people in the country who really feel the way he's speaking. And I'm wondering if this campaign has, in fact, given people permission to express and act upon their prejudices and their hatreds and their whatever.
One of the terms that's been used for that sort of thing a lot has been anxiety. And, you know, there's been actually some ridicule about this idea that the Trump campaign appeals to people's economic anxiety. I follow a lot of journalists, and Manny Iglesias, when he sees someone say something that reflects racial resentment or racism or misogyny or something that has to do with the campaign, he'll retweet it and say, wow, that's some great economic anxiety, right? So he's using it, he's sort of ridiculing the idea that people are really responding to the campaign because of economic anxiety. That may be true, but I do think anxiety, right? Anxiety about the loss of status, about anxiety about the loss of a place within the American, you know, social hierarchy. I think there are genuine status anxieties that Trump has tapped into and made them feel, you know, by virtues, it's sort of like a transference, like by virtue of his own success and the fact that he articulates these concerns about America and about how America's changing that they also share. It feels like he's giving them legitimacy and that he gives them a sense of power, right? So people feel empowered, and I don't think that that's going to go away, even if he loses rather resoundingly. So I think that that's something that we genuinely need to contend with.
Maybe that's one comment on that?
Hi, Peggy Hayes. Two-part question. One is all the retweets of the taco bowl tweet from Trump. Is there any way to know how many of those were ironic? Because I retweeted it because it was so insulting, and I wanted people to see how ridiculous it was. And the second is, could any of you comment on the meme tweets from Hillary as being potentially influential in the way people saw her as sort of can-do, get things done?
Regarding the first part of your question as to how many of the retweets about the taco bowl were ironic, I would say that it's something approaching 100%. I retweeted it, Carole retweeted it.
My mother liked it on Facebook.
There you go.
Anything else?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of your question?
Oh yeah, are you familiar with the tweets from Hillary meme that was running while she was Secretary of State? And it was a meme that was cooked up by a couple of guys sitting in a bar where they took images of Hillary and she was feeding that to Joe Biden and Barack Obama, like, you guys are having fun, but I'm doing the real workout.
Right. As it turned out, it was that picture that led somebody to rat out her private email server.
Well, has this actually been influential in any way?
Influential in what way? In terms of persuasion, in terms of boosting her image, and maybe. I mean, she hired a very tech-savvy team at the State Department, some of whom are very prominent people in the tech world. She had everything going for her coming into this election, actually, to be a very, to earn a reputation as a very tech-savvy campaign, and the email thing has just dogged her. And I mean, it's impossible for her to talk about technology publicly, or for her team to really tout. I think they're real, you know, to some extent, they're real prowess in that space because of the email.
Let's put it back there first, then you, Susan, you go first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Susan Gold, a professor here at Northeastern, and I'm wondering about the post-campaign media and what is going to happen with Trump, Ailes, and the Breitbart guy, and do you think that this aftermath is going to, just like the Tea Party aftermath in Fox, is going to create a whole new right fraction of the public that is going to just completely unhinge our society?
There has been a lot of speculation that Trump has understood for quite a while that he's going to lose, and that what he's really interested in doing is starting a new media venture with Roger Ailes and Steve Bannon of Breitbart that would essentially be probably an internet TV station to the right of Fox. Now that may very well come to pass, but have any of you ever heard the term Trump's razor that Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo came up with? Well, we all know what Occam's razor is. Well, the idea behind Trump's razor is that the stupidest explanation for anything that Donald Trump does is always the correct explanation. So therefore, under the Trump's razor notion, he still thinks he's going to win. But nevertheless, after the election, this could very well be some sort of a new right-wing media venture with Trump, Bannon, and Ailes leading the charge.
I mean, Roger Ailes has been very successful. They just celebrated the 20th anniversary of Fox News, right? So he virtually invented, you know, after CNN, but still reinvented the whole cable news network genre. And, you know, I think he has tremendous potential, and Bannon and Breitbart have an incredible following online. So I think the potential is there, and there's certainly a thirst and people who don't feel that they have representation in the current media spectrum. So I think that's really possible. Are they going to have an incredible influence and totally change our politics? I don't know that that's true. I mean, Tea Party had a significant impact, then it has sort of dissipated over time. You know, the thing about Trump that I think makes him impossible to predict is that he's really volatile. And that's one thing that I've noticed throughout this campaign. You know, with other people, you know, I sometimes teach public opinion, and with other politicians, you can predict what they're going to do by virtue of the trajectory of public opinion. With Trump, I can't predict from day to day at all what he's going to do. And, you know, so he doesn't have the same sort of strategic sort of mindset politically as some of the other candidates, so you don't really know what his goals are. But I do think that the potential for making a large profit, the way The Apprentice was, you know, a life-changing money-making venture for him, this could be the next thing. So I definitely think that that's a possibility, even if it wasn't his master plan all along.
Can I follow up on that for a minute? I think for a lot of people, the emergence of what for a lot of people, I think what's interesting, I think, in this election is the emergence, because of who Donald Trump connects with in many respects, the emergence for a lot of people of names like Alex Jones, and the sort of the not just conservative but really right-wing media that's been there for a long time. You know, and whether you're talking about radio shows like Limbaugh, or you're talking about cable television, or you're talking about now the internet platforms, whether it's Red States or Alex Jones and InfoWars, that exists, especially on the right, in a way that's probably reflective of the distrust of traditional media more than you see perhaps on the left. Is that sort of played out in this election in a way that we hadn't seen before, or is it a variation on a theme?
I think the alt-right, which is this name that's given to, a separate sort of wave of right. I mean, I think you defined it as being white nationalist, but you did. You did. But that's not necessarily all it is. It also includes a lot of conspiracy theorists that think that a lot of things like Sandy Hook was faked by the U.S. government. 9/11 conspiracy theorists. Alex Jones is a really important figure in that, and apparently he and Trump are close. They have telephone conversations. I was just reading about this yesterday, and Alex Jones has said with pride that the things he says on the radio one week, show up in Trump's stump speeches the next week. Alex Jones, yesterday or the day before, on his radio show, I think it was Monday, talked about the fact that he believes that President Obama and Hillary Clinton are actually demonic, and that there is substantive evidence for that because they smell of sulfur and they attract flies.
And the president, of course,
Yeah. So, and the president actually did allude to this in a speech yesterday. So, this person has direct access, right, to one of the major party presidential candidates.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, I accept the fact that the alt-right has many dimensions. I think the fact that all federal government activity have been directed, in their view, by a single African-American man makes it almost impossible to disentangle any of their views from racism, I think. And I think that's just a fact of our reality. Yeah.
That's Michael here. Okay.
Hi, Chris Lovell. I have a question for you. It's kind of a fatal feeling that I feel about our democracy, our ability to make an informed decision between politicians, because we're heading into, it appears to me, a world of entertainment that's far and away exceeding anything having to do with thoughtful decision making. And as I look to you talked about the television becoming is the strongest media outlet that gives people information, and more polarized stations with more and more polarized audiences not listening to both sides and just feeding on themselves. What's left? Debates? We know that those don't work, at least in the last few weeks. So how can you make an informed decision? Maybe I'm just speaking of a utopian democracy where actually everybody thinks, and maybe it hasn't been that way for a long time, but that's the hope anyway. Does anybody have opinions on this?
I got this question from my students a couple weeks ago, and it sounds utopian probably, because you have other jobs to do apart from preparing and deciding which candidate to support. But I really believe in this particular media environment that is so fragmented and is in some ways polarized. I do think that it's really important for everyone to have a media diet that has a range of sources. And so if you're on social media, that means you get to choose who is in your feed, and you can choose a range of voices. So my political position may be in one place, but I make sure that I subscribe to the National Review, which is leading long-standing conservative journal, and I also subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I read the Atlantic and Politico, and you don't have to read 100 and follow 1,000 journalists, but you should have a range, because one of the exercises that we do in my political comm class is to look at how on a single day which stories are chosen in terms of just which are covered, and then also how they are framed differently across different media. And you'll really immediately get to see that it's really important for you to have a multiplicity of sources.
And
so I think that's one way.
And yet I would argue that what's happening now is taking part outside the system that you describe. National Review and the Weekly Standard are probably the two leading conservative political magazines. The Wall Street Journal editorial page is very conservative. They are not on the Trump train.
Right.
National Review has been a leading voice for anti-Trump conservatives. It's hard to think of any organ of anything even remotely mainstream that has not been incredibly critical of Trump. The media source of Trump's power are these conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones and the alt-right website Breitbart, which supplied Trump with his latest campaign guru. I don't know what we do about that. I'm not very optimistic. As I said at the end of my presentation, I think that the scary truth may be that people are better informed, the people who are supporting Trump may be better informed than we're giving them credit for, and they like this. I don't know what to do about that.
But I think there are two different questions. One is an urban question, like what should I do to make my decision, and how can we have a functioning political media environment, right? And that I think we sort of do, and we're working towards that because in some ways this has been the best test, and we've had to question, okay, what is objectivity versus truth? How do we balance the need for some sort of evaluative function of the media versus an unbiased, objective, neutral-seeming media, right? So I think that it's really important and constructive that we're having that conversation and that we have an idea of what, an ideal, sort of like the way citizens should conduct themselves in order to get the information that they need. Then the other question is the one that you're addressing, which is, and what should all of us do if we think that the democracy isn't really functioning despite whatever the quality of the journalism might be. And I think that to some extent you have to then, just trust the public, right? Doesn't mean we stop fighting. I think it's really good that the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing what they're doing. And I also think it's a really good sign that the National Review has risked their following to try to be truthful, right? So I feel like some political journalism is actually really rising to the occasion and trying not to be partisan. I mean, Glenn Beck rose to the occasion.
Glenn Beck did indeed. Just one more quick point and then I'll shut up for a while because you sound so reasonable. There was a Facebook argument going on in my feed just before we went on today, and the person that a few of us were arguing with, somebody said, "Why don't you read a newspaper?" And her response was, "Newspapers? Are you kidding? They have no credibility." This is the world that we live in. This is the world we live in.
I was just going to say, there's been a fair amount of research in recent years about how we sort of depolarize audiences through news, and it's really, I think we're just beginning to understand how this kind of acculturation in terms of values happens. And one thing I was actually just talking to my wife about this last night. One of any of your friends probably has said to you, I grew up in a conservative household, but I ended up a liberal, or I grew up in a liberal household, but I ended up a conservative. And I actually think one thing the Academy should look more at is sort of who are those people, and what's their, what role does media play in those sorts of people, and what do we know about how people travel ideologically? And I think there's a lot of probably research to be done there, and I think really useful stuff in terms of how we raise people in schools and how we talk about news. We have a interpreting a news class, which is very popular here at Northeastern. But I think those skills probably need to be taught at lower levels. But everything we know is that blasting more facts at people actually doesn't change their mind. I think that's a deeply troubling thing, but at the same time, it's sort of human, reality. So I just say that.
Okay, stand over here, then you run over. You're second.
Hi, my name is Nathan Hofstert. I'm a first-year political science student here. Over here.
Hi.
Yeah. So you guys, you talked a lot about how Donald Trump's level of media coverage led him to getting the Republican nomination. So I was wondering if you all had any opinions on whether you think that Bernie Sanders' lack of media coverage led to his failure of getting the Democratic nomination.
That is a great question. I do think that initially there was an imbalance. Certainly initially in terms of media attention to Hillary Clinton versus media attention to Bernie Sanders, and the presumption of Hillary being the nominee. However, I will also say, though, that it does have something to do with Bernie Sanders as a candidate and the fact that he really went against the grain in terms of our, he really stretched the boundaries in terms of our normal range of ideological positions. Because, 2 years ago, if you told me an independent socialist was going to be, like this close to clinching the nomination for the Democrat, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean, I truly did used to tell him, please. He's a self-avowed socialist. That's just impossible. And yet, he pushed the boundaries of acceptability, and we discovered, both through Trump and through Sanders, that the American public is not as wedded to traditional definitions of ideology as we thought they were, and that's really important. But I think that that's part of the story. And then there's also, this this qualitative, missing element. Barack Obama, when he emerged on the scene, no one thought he could win initially, right? And Hillary Clinton was a presumptive nominee then too. And even more so in 2008. She had all of the money. In the invisible primary, which is what political scientists call the endorsement and the money sort of primary that comes before, she was the winner. And yet, Barack Obama managed to, for a variety of reasons, win people over and eventually become the favored person in terms of the media. I think Sanders, there was no reason why, to my mind, why Sanders couldn't, apart from some of these other actors, do the same thing. So I don't think it was prohibitive. I don't think she was a prohibitive presumptive nominee in 2016, more so than in 2008. But yeah, there was certainly an imbalance in terms of the media attention that hurt early on.
Yeah, and I agree with Carole that the imbalance in media attention for Bernie Sanders was early. I think that once he began to build support, I think the coverage evened out pretty quickly, and I also think that the coverage of Sanders tended to be more positive than coverage of Clinton. We forget, but Donald Trump is not the only candidate who refused to release his tax returns this year. Bernie Sanders refused to release his tax returns too, and he seemed to have paid considerably less of a political price for that. I think that there were strong reasons to believe that Sanders was never going to quite get over the hump, and that may have hurt with the media. And one of those is, Carole makes the analogy to Barack Obama. Well, once Obama showed some early strength, it was fairly clear that he was going to do very well with African American voters who had traditionally been a strength of both Clintons. Whereas it never seemed to be plausible that Bernie Sanders was ever going to do very well with African American voters. So there was a credibility hump there for Sanders that I don't think he was ever able to quite get over. I mean, in the end, the reason that Sanders lost is because fewer people voted for him. And, that's just simple math.
In a Democratic primary, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, you first. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you were there first.
Jean McKnight. It's interesting we started talking now about Barack Obama because, Carole, you put up a slide, the title of which was Politics and Pop Culture, and you have an image, a well-known image of Barack Obama. And what I want to put forth is this concept. You talked about celebrity candidates. I think Barack Obama was the first celebrity candidate. In 2006, he got the opportunity, he was just a state senator from Illinois, and he got the opportunity to speak at the Democratic National Convention. I heard him speak there, actually. And what I remember is Election night, 2012, I was at Park Plaza, Boston, you know, and Barack Obama was re-elected. That was what was so exciting. And it made me so happy. Because then he was the president, a well-known man, not a celebrity. I think there's a difference between being a celebrity and being a well-known person. Even Ronald Reagan, who you said was one of our celebrity candidates, he had been a union leader. He was the elected governor of a state, even though that is 10% of the population of this country. He was legitimately a well-known man. And so I throw out to you that it really was Barack Obama who was the first celebrity candidate.
Well, I do say that Ronald Reagan certainly, you know, his celebrity as an actor, I think this died, certainly helped. Initially, he was the president of Screen Actors Guild, right? And then he was governor of California. He was around for a long time in politics before he got the Republican nomination. I think Barack Obama rose really quickly. But in terms of having that sort of celebrity image, I think JFK also had that sort of celebrity image. And John McCain did run an ad, actually. I think the name of the ad was called Celebrity, against Barack Obama, that made that sort of accusation of, you know, well, it's really sort of a cult of celebrity, and it sort of positioned him as having adoring crowds, actually kind of like Hitler had adoring crowds, right? And this is dangerous and we can't afford this. So I definitely think that accusation is something, or that characterization is something that he's had to contend with. But I also think, you know, that 2004 speech at the Democratic National Convention thrust him onto the national stage as a credible political figure with a message that I think America really wanted to hear. And so his theme was, there's not a black America, there's not a white America, you know, there's not a blue America or red America, there's the United States of America. And parts of his speech became ringtones, right? Like that speech back in 2004 resonated so well that that became a ringtone. So, you know, I think he was able to combine sort of like a political seriousness and also the charisma to be, you know, a celebrity that really worked the entertainment circuit really well. I don't think that made him, you know, absolutely unique, but I absolutely agree that it worked in his favor.
I was just going to say, we have the rare privilege of being in a room with somebody who's actually done this. So I actually asked Governor a little bit about how you saw the race and compared to your own race, and so
I have a question of you guys and a brief comment. Kitty and I are now, well, on December 26th, she will reach her 80th birthday, and I'm older than she is. We are totally out of this world. And I suspect I speak for more than a few folks. I wouldn't know if Facebook or Twitter could be in the park, and I could care less. I read 2 newspapers. I don't spend a lot of time on television except for the last 3 innings of the Red Sox game. Get a lot of messages on my email, some of which I read, if I think they're worth anything. So my question is, what percentage of the American electorate is living in this social media world? Do we know?
Yeah, I think the Pew Research Center data is pretty, I mean, they're sort of the gold standard, and I think, you know, for American adults on Twitter, I think it's probably like 15%.
15?
Yeah. Facebook, though, is very, very high, and actually...
What's that?
30%.
70%.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily receive political information there, or engage politically.
Do we have any idea how many of them use Facebook to kind of engage in political discussion, information gathering? What do you think?
No, I was going to say, you have the stats that 35% of the youngest adult demographic said that they, you know, what was found it most useful, right? So, I was actually going to say that exact. So I thought that was funny. So we know that in the younger voting age demographics that social media is incredibly important. But what I find ironic whenever people say that they get their political information from Facebook, what does that really mean? Are they reading, paragraphs about personal feelings about politics of their friends? Not usually. I mean, maybe there's a sentence or two, but when they go to Facebook for political information, where is it actually coming from?
It's taking them to it.
It's.
I hope that it's coming from mainstream news sources that their friends are sharing with.
But just give me an estimate, Dan, of the entire electorate. What percentage of it is kind of in this world politically? Not, posting this, that, and the other thing about themselves and their friends and all that, but I'm saying, use it as an important source of information. What are we talking about? What percent is the electorate?
Well, I'm not sure that, I think that people who say, I'm going to go on Facebook because that's my best source of political news, I don't think anybody's doing that if they think about it, because Facebook controls what you see in ways that are not transparent, and people don't like that. So I think that the political news that's reaching people on Facebook is a more casual and haphazard variety among people who are, they may have some interest in politics, but they're not obsessed with politics the way probably the three of us are, or that you and Mrs. Dukakis are.
Well, so here's my comment. There's no question that it's playing some significant role in this. But they happen to be at this moment, folks. I can't speak for the Trump campaign. I think there's very little of this. But in the Clinton campaign, there are literally thousands of people out in neighborhoods knocking on people's doors and providing them with information. My own view is that there's nothing more effective than that. I don't care what's going on in the media.
Well, that's true, right?
That's
like
true.
we have data for that.
Especially
that is the most
if this person happens to be a neighbor, or is the precinct captain or the block captain or whatever. And this is going on very intensively right now. Now it's not going on as broadly as I would have hoped. I think I've mentioned in previous sessions that Howard Dean and I tried our best to see if we could persuade the Clinton campaign to make it a 50-state campaign, because we suspected maybe that this red-blue thing wasn't so subtle. And all of a sudden, folks, we're discovering 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 so-called red states are now in play. Hillary is 3 points behind Trump in Texas. Just want to lay that out there. And she's apparently ahead now in Georgia.
Tied in Utah, as of yesterday.
Anyway, so if it's reassuring at all to those of you who are elderly like us, there is this army of people who are communicating and trying to provide voters in the most effective way you can do it, and that's on their doorstep. And we're just beginning to get a sense of what's happening in the early voting. And it appears that Clinton is doing significantly better. I think I'm right in saying this, Dan, in the early voting, which has everything to do with who's been working the precincts. Doesn't mean that this stuff hasn't had an impact, isn't having an impact. But candidates who take precinct-based grassroots organizing seriously should not fear that they're somehow going to be blown out of the process with all of this stuff. Again, not to say that it's not significant. And if more and more young people become middle-aged people, but believe me, that neighbor walking the streets and knocking on your doors can have a tremendous impact. And it'll be interesting to see if we see that again. Not as broad and as effectively done as I think, as my friend Governor Dean and I hoped it would be. And it's very difficult now to kind of get up to speed with that kind of campaign if you haven't been doing it for 6 months. But there is another way to communicate. That's all I'm going to say. And it's through real live people. And it's the cheapest way to do it. Walking the streets and knocking on their neighbors' doors. Well, we'll see, Chris, on the 8th of November, whether or not it's had in.
I just want to say that communication research actually shows that that is by far the most effective. The best return on money that you can make is with the canvassing, with the phone calls to a lesser extent, but the door-to-door canvassing by far the most effective.
Not the phone calls so much.
Yeah.
I'm not a
But the
believer
door-to-door
in phone back, folks. It may be 1%. Door-to-door, person-to-person, 5 to 10%. Easy.
Good evening. I'm a graduate of journalism school, and at the time, I was very excited about my career until I realized that most of what I'd be doing is writing things about people that they did not want me to write about. And I really wanted something to do that was more appealing in that respect. I thought of this when the story about Donna Brazile came out, because she's a journalist that I'm of the Walter Cronkite era. I want to look up to my journalists and think of them as sacrosanct, but I was very concerned about that story. I wonder what your thoughts are about the personal attacks on journalism because of the animosity of this campaign cycle, and also if any of you have an opinion about whether she actually did what they said she did. Just
remind people what some people may not know the story.
The story that apparently came out in the WikiLeaks, that there was an email saying that she did give, or at least allude to giving, advance notice of questions to Hillary Clinton.
Yes, and apparently she's denied it, and I don't know of any reason why we wouldn't take her denial seriously. She certainly doesn't have a history of lying about things like that. And we know that there's been some suspicions that there's been some monkeying around with what's in the WikiLeaks documents. So it's very hard to know what to make of that. I would say more broadly, though, that I don't really understand why news organizations like CNN employ and pay purely partisan people. And I would include Donna Brazile among that group. I think she's a perfectly respectable commentator, but I don't really want to see her on CNN. I mean, she's a political activist.
She's the current chair of the DNC.
At least she doesn't do both at the same time. We'll give her that. I mean, on the other side, you've got former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski acting in the same capacity on CNN, and apparently he has signed a non-disparagement agreement with Trump. So if he wants to criticize Trump, he has to think about, what's this going to cost me if I say that? And until very recently, even while he was on the CNN payroll, he was also still getting money from the Trump campaign. Now, Lewandowski is an extreme example of that, but quite frankly, I don't want to hear from any of these people. There are plenty of liberal opinion journalists and conservative opinion journalists who we can hear from without having to resort to pure partisans. I don't like it.
Maybe part of the post-election conversation that needs to happen is really not just about the candidates, but really we should be having this post-election conversation about journalism. And I think that your presentation was a great start for that.
Well, actually, let me follow up, because I think after every election there's a post-election sort of breastfeeding about journalism. So, I mean, it's sort of like, what did we do wrong this time?
Yeah.
And I guess the really interesting structural question is, because if I looked at the data, I think, John, that you were showing on age groups and what they're actually putting in the news, I mean, we see that at the, shall we say, the older end of the age distribution, it's the network news, right? And then your network news and local news. I can bet among my students that they don't even know network news and local news exists, and they're getting their stuff, off of social media stuff, and maybe connecting other things, but they're certainly not watching television. And that's an interesting point, because it wasn't long ago where television network news was the sort of gatekeeper intermediary for what was legitimate news. And so the question, I guess, especially given the rise of social media platforms of various kinds, I mean, as I tell my students, this is not a phone, it's a crappy phone, in fact. It's an internet device. So the question is, how does that materially change? Let's project out 10 years, 12 years. Network news may not really exist anymore in the way we think about it. What then? And so how does the social media landscape and how does the new media landscape shape the way we look at campaigns? I mean, that may be like an impossible question.
I would say it's a little bit impossible because, I mean, 12 years ago we didn't have Twitter, right? I think it was 2007. So we don't know what the next platform will be. So I think it's really difficult to envision, but I do think the fragmentation will continue, right? And the division of messages down to these, reduction down to these really tiny sound bites. I don't know, that seems to be continuing. So I'm not sure what we do to produce and package information in a way that's meaningful. If the attention span and the appetite continues to narrow that way.
John, thoughts?
It's a really difficult question. I do think there do seem to be some fundamentals related to human attention that suggest that we won't probably ever have 1 million channels, right? There are certain sort of network effects and kind of what we call power laws. If you talk to the network science people here, Northeastern will tell you all about this. The distribution of human attention tends to actually follow a power law, and that is true, irrespective of what kinds of channels are out there. There's something about human nature that I think that means that attention tends to aggregate around certain things, and I think as long as they can figure out a business model around it, we may see some reconsolidation in 10 years. We don't really know. I mean, the history of media is fascinating in terms of, prior to the FCC or the prior to whatever the FCC regulator was, there were thousands of radio stations in New York City, like thousands, because there was no regulation of the airwave. So regulation may play a role. Public policy may play a role in this. We don't know. I mean, they're talking about disrupting the set-top box right now, the traditional cable box. The consequences of that could be massive. We don't know yet, and so I think anyway.
Well, Dan, I just thought in my head that you studied Jeff Bezos, and we have John Henry here at the Boston Globe. The old days of Colonel McCormick owning the Tribune, and the fact is that maybe we're going back to rich men owning newspapers or platforms as, maybe not as profit leaders, but as devices for their own purposes? Is that possible?
Well, what we may be moving away from, at least in a small way, is a situation that developed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where the great family newspapers fell into the hands of publicly traded corporations that now they cut in order to stem the losses, but for years they cut to maximize profits and cut the newsrooms. It's interesting because I think Jeff Bezos and John Henry are probably the two leading examples of wealthy people who got into the newspaper business for what appear to be the right reasons, and yet neither one of them has shown much interest in using their muscle to act as, press barons the way that William Randolph Hearst did back in the day. Jeff Bezos hasn't even touched the Washington Post's editorial page. John Henry has a little bit, but no more than you would expect any owner to do. And neither one of them seems to be interested in running their papers at a loss. The Washington Post being privately held, well, they're both privately held. You talk to people at the Post, And they'll tell you that the Post is running a small operating loss, but not as much as people outside might think. And what is an operating loss of the Washington Post? It's hard to know, because Jeff Bezos is leveraging the Post with Amazon so that it's part of Amazon Prime, it comes pre-installed on a Kindle Fire. It's certainly going to be part of the Echo. You know, Alexa, read me the Washington Post headlines this morning. Meanwhile, the Boston Globe, which doesn't have the ability to do that kind of leveraging, under John Henry, you know, continues to do some cutting here and there. It continues to get smaller because he has said he is not interested in running a profit, but he's not going to run it at a loss either. So the idea that newspapers are becoming, you know, rich man's playthings doesn't seem to be borne out. You remember that scene in Citizen Kane where Charles Foster Kane tells his former guardian, yes, I am going to lose $1 million this year, and I'll lose $1 million next year and the year after that. And at this rate, I'll run out of money in 160 years, or whatever it is. It's a great line, but I don't really see that going on today. The wealthy people who have gotten involved in the newspaper business want to run those newspapers as businesses, which actually is a good thing for whoever might come after them, because, you know, if John Henry runs the Globe at a huge loss, and then he decides he's sick of running the Globe and he sells it to somebody else, they're going to just start cutting it immediately. So it's good to have some fiscal discipline, I think.
Why don't you go ahead and two more questions.
All right, is this on? Yes. Hi, I'm Bruce from Providence. And early in the presentation, you mentioned that media does not work well when one candidate is unqualified. And I've been thinking a lot about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I'm quite serious. If you go to Axis 2, Cluster B, Dramatic Personalities, you will find the narcissistic personality disorder, and you will find in there a subtype, the overt narcissist. And when you combine a narcissistic personality, such as the one we're seeing, with the long tradition of anti-intellectualism in American political life, Richard Hofstadter, etc., going back many decades, 100 years or more, you combine that, when you combine the elements of proto-fascism and all of the other horrific stuff we're seeing, the question is, what is the media's role in all of this, particularly in light of someone who is a master manipulator, who is clearly at work. He's brilliant in some respects, but clearly an incredibly dangerous human being in other respects. What's your responsibility with that? What's the media's responsibility?
That's very difficult, and I think that that's the challenge that the media are trying to figure out in a campaign in which it's really not enough to cover both candidates as if they were, you know, qualified people with different ideas for how they think the country ought to be run. One thing that I don't think is the media's role is to try to psychoanalyze a candidate from afar. If a qualified psychiatrist had examined, well, you mentioned one of these candidates being a dangerous narcissist. You're talking about Tim Kaine? No, not Tim Kaine, okay. But seriously, if a qualified psychiatrist had examined Donald Trump and had found some of these problems that you talk about and that we all frankly suspect are in fact true, and that report somehow got out, well then I think that's certainly fair game for the media to report on that. But I think trying to psychoanalyze from afar is difficult. There was a very well-qualified psychiatrist on the public radio show On the Media recently talking about exactly that. And they were talking about the fact that the psychiatric code of ethics really prohibits a psychiatrist from speculating from afar on a public figure's mental health. But I do think that that there's ample evidence that Donald Trump is unqualified by reason of experience and temperament. It's simply a matter of fact that he has said things that are racist and has encouraged violence and all that. And I don't think that that message can be driven home enough. And another thing the media can do, the news broke while you were sitting here tonight. The New York Times is reporting that 2 women have come forward to say that they were physically violated by Donald Trump in public places. And we need to keep, the media need to keep reporting this because it's important.
So, I agree with everything that you said. One thing, in the extreme, I do think that the media or journalists have started to realize that it's very important to, be honest, even if they fear. I think the big thing is that they fear, one, violating journalistic norms of objectivity, right? Which objectivity versus neutrality, or the appearance of neutrality, the appearance of neutrality should not be a higher journalistic norm than the provision of truth, right? But at the same time, I think they've also sometimes fallen down on the job, even in this late stage, in terms of wanting, bar some specific story like the one you just mentioned, they really want to make these candidates equivalent.
Yes.
So after the last debate, after the second debate, a lot of the initial analysis said things like, the candidates got nasty, right? And so they present this picture as though there is an equivalence between these 2 candidates really too often. And I think that's the fallback position. And then the other thing that happens, and there was a really good article about this yesterday, is that the initial analysis really seems to grade, if anyone's a golfer here, you know that your handicap is based on your past performance. And so you can win against a better, more skilled opponent, and because your performance, is, I don't know, you get points taken off, right? So you really shoot a 90, but if your handicap's an 18, then it seems like you really shot par, which is 72 for a lot of courses. And the person you're playing with maybe has a handicap of 10, so if they shoot the same thing, you win, right? And I think that that's exactly what we're seeing with the debates. So after the debate, you get, at least an hour of cable television saying, oh, I think Trump won this. But then when you actually get in the polls from the viewers at home, you see that, all of the scientific polls afterwards say, no, actually Hillary Clinton won this. And we're not sure why we're seeing all this cable television commentary that acts as though he behaved sort of normally and did well and, might turn this thing around. So I think that there is a handicapping and a false equivalence that we still have to really take the mainstream media to task for.
I agree completely.
Final question.
At the beginning, my name is Barbara Bates. At the beginning, you mentioned that the news media do not do a good job of discussing ideas or candidates' policy positions and the pros and the cons of that. What has to change for that to change? Do we have to revert to movies and television shows to give us issues and factual coverage?
I'm not sure that the media have ever done a good job of covering issues. Even if you go back to the pre-television era, I think that broad themes get communicated. And as I said, I do think that in a general election between 2 normal candidates, we get the idea that, the Republican candidate will generally support tax cuts, the Democratic candidate will generally support expanded social programs, and, maybe for the average voter, that may be enough. That may be enough detail on which to base a decision. But where I think the real problem is, and I don't know what can be done about this, by the way, the information's always out there. For people who are really, really interested in this stuff, they can go to the candidates' websites, can't they? In the primaries in particular, you have people having these long lists of very nuanced positions. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were both, you know, to the left of center. Hillary Clinton a little bit, Bernie Sanders quite a bit. And so there would be a lot of nuance and details to how they differ on the issues. And all we really got in media coverage was, you know, they're attacking each other. Sanders is saying that Clinton's not enough of a reformer. Clinton's saying that Sanders is pie in the sky, and that's about all we heard of that. I don't know that we're ever really going to get past that. I think that the attention span of the public may not allow for it, quite frankly.
I would just add that, so I've seen some of the research on, you know, obviously the greater attention to horse race coverage versus coverage of issues and candidates' positions. And my bias is that I assumed that that was just in certain media. But actually, I saw a study that included the New York Times, and the New York Times, their majority, and an increasing proportion, was also of the horse race coverage, right? Yeah. So it's a serious problem, but it is not, you know, not all media are created equal, and you do have more substantive coverage in the newspaper. So one of the first things that I researched was coverage of the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003. And so I did a study of that compared coverage in national newspapers, national broadcast networks, and cable television. And the quality and the quantity of information and the depth of information on what those tax cuts would mean for different groups really varied quite substantially across the different, the three different mediums. So, you know, newspaper will always give you a greater depth of factual information than television. I knew that going in, but I didn't know, you know, that the stories would be this short looking at the television transcripts. I mean, it was truly, if you're looking to television as your #1 source of information, you are not going to be getting depth of information. So that, you know, that was quite clear.
Can I add something to that before John? Just very quickly.
The press is different.
I don't want to sound cynical about this, but I think a lot of times candidates' position papers have a degree of political cynicism to them. And so therefore, I think that when the media considers their issues, they're best picked up with a pair of tweezers sometimes. And I mean, one quick example, and then I'll turn over the mic. You look back to the 2008 campaign between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Well, they both proposed to do big, serious things about healthcare reform. And if you didn't know any more than that, you know what, it was probably enough. Because the fact is, once Barack Obama was in office, he actually borrowed some pretty important ideas from the Clinton campaign that he had criticized pretty vociferously during their contest against each other. So, you know, honestly, I think a lot of times broad themes matter more than the specifics of their plans. They hire policy experts. I'm not a policy expert, I'm a journalist.
John, last comment.
I guess, first of all, thank you everyone for coming out. Just one point, which is that the news media, in terms of the quality and depth of reporting across at least the sort of elite mainstream outlets, is actually much better than it was in the 50s and the 60s. And Michael Schudson, who's maybe our leading sort of news sociologist at Columbia University, gave a talk and said there's just no question, all of the studies show that sort of at least the elite mainstream media has more diverse voices, has a higher quality of analysis, is more data driven. It's just a fact. So I guess there are just cross currents going on right now. There's both shallowness, also depth, and I hate to just hear the media just sort of run down entirely. So,
well, I mean,
yeah.
I definitely found that the newspaper certainly had a different depth than television. You know, than.
Yeah.
So. We'll have to take this up over dinner. Sorry, we'll have to take this up over dinner. Just final comment. If you go back to the very beginning of the Republic, there was always this question about the role of media. And in fact, the framers used media to agitate on behalf of the new Constitution. The Federalist Papers, propaganda done through media. So, and in cartoons against the king, all kinds of stuff. So the question always was, are media merely pipelines or are they shapers? And we'll never resolve that issue, even in 140 characters or less. We'll see you next week.
Yeah. Nice work. Great. That's fun.